So now we're going to move over and talk about France for a little while here, who experienced similar confessional debates over exorcism as we saw in England, although they played out a little differently because, of course, the official religion in France was Catholicism. However, exorcism was still used as a method to demonstrate religious authority and to win converts. Perhaps no better case demonstrates this than the exorcisms that took place in Loudun, France, which of course was the topic of the letter that you read by Thomas Killigrew. So in 1632, the nunnery at Loudun, France became the site of one of the most notorious and retold instances of witchcraft and exorcism in the history of early modern Europe. There's even a modern novel, a film, as well as an opera that all deal with this particular story. The demon possessions and court case that followed reveal a number of important elements that were present in all witch hunts and trials that happened throughout this period. And according to one scholar, the possessions at Loudun became a great public trial, a confrontation between science and religion, a debate on what is certain and what is uncertain, on reason, the supernatural, and authority. The possession itself began in 1632 when a nun at the Loudun Abbey by the name of Jeanne des Anges, the most famous of the nuns, began to complain of symptoms of being demonically possessed. Other nuns in the abbey followed suit, and as many as 17 in total all exhibited the same symptoms as the original nun did. The Jesuit priests subsequently started to perform exorcisms on the nuns to remove the demons. The possessions took a variety of forms, including convulsive fits, erratic movement of the limbs and body, inexplicable changes to various body parts, such as the swelling, some of the symptoms we talked about in our last class. They were seen to be illicitly and lusty speech was one of the symptoms, incredible strength, as well as violent reactions to Catholic religious symbols and implements in their various forms, such as relics or the sacrament. One contemporary account describes the following scene at Loudun. During the hour from 6 to 7 of the evening, there appeared another specter that went and threw said Sister Marthe violently to the ground and the said prioress onto a chair, taking each one by the shoulders. And at the same time, 2 other nuns felt their legs struck, where red contusions the size of small coins remained for 8 days. And even when they did not see anything, they often heard voices calling out to one another. Some were punched with fists, some slapped, some felt themselves being prompted to a moderate and involuntary laughter. So these were some of the original symptoms that the nuns exhibited. So during these early possessions, the nuns blamed one priest in particular for causing their bewitchment or their possessions, and his name was Urbain Grandier. In examining the case, we can start to see some of the more overt sexual as well as the political nature of the witchcraft accusations. Many people in the community of Loudun believe that the nuns had accused Grandier of witchcraft originally because they had become sexually obsessed with him, especially the principal nun, Jeanne des Anges. Some believe that it was through Jeanne's influence that other nuns in the abbey began to act out in similar ways. So initially, at least, there's a certain amount of skepticism about both the authenticity of the possessions as well as the motive. There was some speculation as to why this was happening in relation to Grandier. To make matters more suspect, Grandier did not have a great reputation locally. It was a small community. Rumors spread quickly. Grandier was thought to be sexually immoral, and rumors had, before this time at least, circulated in the town about certain sexual exploits that he had had with a number of young women, and some even thought that he had made one young woman pregnant. So he was considered somewhat of a sexually dangerous priest, which put him in a very precarious social position and outside of an acceptable social order. He was also thought to be a handsome man who had power over the women in the town, and this spread to power over women in the abbey. Here's a picture of Urbain Grandier. You can determine for yourselves what you think. While the nuns were in a possessed state, they also exhibited symptoms that were sexual in nature, and while they were possessed, they specifically named Grandier as the cause of their possession. A contemporary letter from a priest describes the possessed actions of some of the nuns. On the very same day that Sister Ange, an Ursuline novice, took her vows, she was possessed by the devil, as the Mother Prioress told me personally. The charm was a bouquet of musk roses that were on a dormitory step. The Mother Prioress, having picked it up, smelled it, as did a few others after her, who were all immediately possessed. They began to cry out, calling Grandier, with whom they were so smitten that neither the other nuns nor any other persons could hold them back. They tried to go and find him, and to do so got up and ran on the convent roofs, climbed trees in their chemises or their nightdresses, and remained perched at the very end of the branches. There, after frightful cries, they endured hail, frost, and rain, remaining 4 or 5 days without eating. So on top of the rumors and the accusations made by the nuns, Grandier had also written a pamphlet in support of Catholic priests being able to marry. So also something that kind of put him in a precarious position in relation to religious authority and other local ecclesiastical leaders. Most importantly, it had set him at odds with Cardinal Richelieu, who was perhaps the most powerful priest and political leader in France at this time. He served as King Louis XIII's central administrator. We have to keep in mind that in 1632, religious divisions were political. There's no separation between the two. And Loudun had been at the center of religious wars. 60 years earlier, bloody confrontations had taken place between the Huguenots, who were French Protestants, and Catholics. In the mid-16th century, at the height of Reform and Counter-Reformation movements, the Huguenots took over the city, burning and stripping the churches of their ornaments and images as they went, with the motto, "Long live the gospel, Mass is abolished." Of course, the Protestants wanted to purge anything that resembled Catholic ritual at this time. 10 years after this initial event, the Catholics did the same back to the Huguenots in a series of massacres. And they were known as St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572, which was targeted mob violence essentially against Catholics, against Protestants. Violence that lasted over periods of months, and it pitted all levels of society against each other, so political, at the highest political levels, as well as neighbor fighting neighbor. In a series of violent confrontations, there were at least 5,000 people killed, and it served to heighten and cement political tensions between Catholics and Protestants throughout this period and into the one that we're discussing now. At the time of the demon possessions that happened at the Loudun Abbey, the city was primarily inhabited by Protestants. However, political power was predominantly in the hands of Catholics, and this was an important point of contest in the community. So it was the site of heightened religious tensions, is the point I want to make here. And through his writings and his actions, Grandier had set himself at odds with various members of the Catholic elite in Loudun. Although he was a Catholic himself, he still set himself kind of in opposition to a number of powerful Catholic men. And this is a position that, in the end, would set to determine the outcome and conditions of his trial we will see. So each of the possessed nuns were individually examined by a host of clerical as well as medical authorities who debated the cause and authenticity of their possession symptoms. Initially, the charges of witchcraft filed against Grandier were found to be fraudulent because of the surrounding circumstances of those accusations. Like I mentioned, the people believed that the nuns had become obsessed with them, not with him, not that they were necessarily possessed. However, Grandier's political divisions with important people in the town worked against him, and a new trial was initiated by the religious elite, who was supported. This trial was supported by Cardinal Richelieu. So, although he was found not guilty of witchcraft initially, a second trial was initiated to retry him and collect more evidence. This aspect of the trial helps us to think a little bit about how witchcraft accusations are initiated in the first place. So we see an initial case of demon possession that could potentially be disregarded as a personal vendetta, but is then taken up by the elite and transformed into something with greater political and religious consequences. Consequences that perhaps the nuns did not themselves anticipate in the beginning. By the end of the trial, with the support of both priests and doctors, the possessions were determined by a jury to be legitimate and have a supernatural rather than natural cause. Additionally, the nuns were subject to a number of medical procedures, such as bleeding and various potions, to try and cure them naturally of their symptoms, and of course these did not work. So a lot of the tests and trials that we talked about in our last class were also used in the Loudun case. However, they didn't work, so medical explanations were disregarded. There were a number of explanations given for determining that it was supernatural rather than natural. While they were in a state of possession, the women were able to respond to questions posed to them in Latin, and they also responded in Latin, even though they claimed to have no prior knowledge of the language. One of the doctors involved in the case argued that during her fits, even though the nun violently and continually thrashed her body around, her breathing and pulse stayed the same, which was thought to be a sign of unnatural and therefore diabolical symptoms, because it was unnatural that her pulse would not be raised after moving around the room so dramatically. She was also tested to see how she would respond to painful stimulus, and she was impervious to pain while she was in a state of possession. Just to give you a sense of the way that the doctors were examining the nuns and what they thought about the possession, I've just done up a list of the various demons that were thought to be lodged in one of the particular nuns and where the demon was thought to be. So this is how they interpreted one of the nuns' possession symptoms and attributed to various demons that were possessing her. So in the end, while there were natural causes suggested for the symptoms, it was determined to have supernatural causes. However, it's important to keep in mind that it was only after the religious authorities got involved in the case, who they also chose specific doctors to examine the nuns, that the possessions were argued to be legitimate. Grandier was tortured, tried, and executed by burning at the stake for witchcraft in 1634, 2 years after the initial possessions began.